prices as some economists initially expected. All right, let's bring in our political panel now tonight. Joining us, John Thomas, Republican strategist, and David Tafuri, former foreign policy advisor for the Obama campaign. John, let's start with you. And I think there were a lot of eyes today on Michigan and President Trump and how maybe his second go-around, he might try to talk about the issue of affordability. The first time that his advisor said he was out there to do that, he spent maybe 5% of his time actually talking about the economy. What did you make of what you heard from the president today?
Well, I think what we saw today was an admission that the president, as he starts to look towards the midterm cycle, election cycle, has to focus on his domestic agenda and affordability, lowering prices, lowering gas prices, eggs prices, potentially capping credit card interest rates. Those are things that American voters are going to make their decision based upon whether or not the Republicans hold power, not the stuff that honestly has been consuming President Trump very publicly, which has been foreign policy. Although that's important, it's not typically the decisions that midterm voters turn their ballot on.
And David, this was an issue that was a key one for President Trump in terms of winning the last presidential election. What did you make of his messaging today?
Well, it was, and that's why he needs to be very careful, because one of the things that did in the Biden and Kamala campaigns is they were telling people that the economy isn't that bad, that the inflation isn't that bad, and that's not what people felt. Now, we got numbers today on the inflation in 2025. It was 2.7%. So it's tempered, and President Trump does have a right to boast about that, but saying it was defeated is perhaps not correct, because remember, the Federal Reserve was targeting 2% for inflation. So it's above that, above what economists would like for it to be. And I would also say that while those who predicted inflation would go up a lot because of tariffs may have been wrong so far, we don't know what the impact of tariffs will be in the coming year, because some consumer providers were probably using inventory that they obtained before the tariffs went into place. So we haven't seen the full impact of the tariffs. I'm not saying it's going to result in higher prices, but some are predicting that.
John, let's talk about those numbers. So the 2.7% inflation, this is year over year. So comparing this or last December to the December before. If you break it down, though, in terms of food prices, it was 3.1%, so a bit higher. Do you think those numbers are calming Republicans and the president right now, or is that maybe a little higher than what they were hoping for?
Look, I don't think anything should really be calming the president right now. I mean, history should not be calming the president right now. Typically, the party in power loses the midterm cycle almost always. So there should be nothing calming the president right now. But there are things that he can point to as a result in part of his tariff plan, like record foreign investment into the United States. And there's a lag on those factories getting built and things being made in America and prices coming down. And that's the big question is the American public going to understand that? Are they going to be patient? I think also energy prices, the recent move in Venezuela has the potential of bringing gas prices, energy prices even lower. But the question is, are Americans going to feel that before the midterm cycle? I think that's what this is going to turn on.
Yeah, American voters, not traditionally the most patient people in the world. David, which party, because this is something the Democrats are trying to message on as well, which party right now do you think is better positioned when it comes to affordability? The Republicans, who are in power, and like you said, a tough situation often for the midterms, or the Democrats?
I would say it's a tie right now, given the numbers that came out. They weren't great, but they were perhaps better than expected, better than a year ago. So I think most people probably have a wait and see attitude. They want to see the full impact of Trump's changes and his tariffs in the coming year. And let's be honest, it's the coming year that's going to matter. People aren't going to vote on the economy in 2025. In November, they're going to vote on the economy in 2026. So the Trump administration should be making.
Have they done enough to win over some of those voters who clearly went to Donald Trump because of that exact issue in the last election?
Have Democrats done enough? I mean, Democrats are not in power. So I think Democrats can only criticize and point out the problems. And I think that's what they'll do if the economy gets worse, if inflation goes up, if unemployment goes up. But I think we're in kind of a wait and see attitude. I don't think we can predict how the economy is going to impact the election because we're too far away from the election at this point. But I think the Trump administration and President Trump recognize that probably people are going to vote on this issue and he needs to address it.
John, last question on the economy, then I do want to move on to Iran. But, we heard the president say a couple of months ago that, if he had to grade the economy, he would say it was an A++++. I think it was 5 pluses. He was criticized, I think, at the time for being a bit out of touch with how real Americans are feeling the economy. Do you think he's maybe getting a little bit more in tune with regular Americans?
Well, it's really kind of interesting. On the one hand, if you look at certain indicators, such as the stock market, it is A+++. If you look at certain indicators of hard asset holders, arguably it's an A+ in some parts of the country. But certainly, I think what President Trump, and you can just see it in his speech today, is a recognition that there are a lot of Americans that are still, interest rates are far too high, that there isn't enough supply of housing and the cost of the existing housing is simply too high. And you're seeing the president speak to that. I think that's the important first step, but he has to stay on it and not drift away to the temptation to point to things that are actually doing incredibly well, like the stock market, but may not touch every American that's going to the polls in the midterms.
I want to talk about this major story that we've been following the last days and weeks, and those are those big protests taking place right now in Iran. We've heard the president with some very strong messaging supporting the protest movement there. David, as a former foreign policy advisor for the Obama campaign, where do you think the president goes from here? What kind of actual support do you think this administration might be willing to provide those protesters?
That's really the big question that no one knows the answer to yet. And we get some indication from his Truth Social posts, but we can't be certain that he intends to follow up on that. Let's remember, this president ran on not intervening in other countries, ran essentially on being an isolationist. He pretty much shocked the world when he did the operation in Venezuela that showed that he's not going to be necessarily an isolationist, and he is willing to use intervention when he believes it's necessary. So perhaps that suggests he might do something in Iran, but it's much more difficult to decide and figure out what we would do in Iran. I think the protests are overwhelming and the regime is having a very hard time dealing with them. But many of us are skeptical that there can be actual regime change in Iran without an armed opposition or without an intervention from another country. So far, that intervention has not happened. Also, there isn't an armed opposition, and there doesn't seem to be a plan to arm the opponents of the regime in Iran. So we have to worry that the Iranian regime could at any point turn to violence, kill protesters, detain protesters, torture protesters in order to put down the uprising.
John, to what extent do you think the U.S. and President Trump should get involved in everything that's taking place there in Iran?
Well, first, I think that in part the reason you're seeing such large protests and sustained protests is really a result of President Trump. I think that the Iranian people feel that Trump will have their back, and Trump seems to be indicating as much. I think it's incredible to see the protests going on as long as they have, given the fact I believe that the regime has gotten violent against thousands of the protesters, and yet the protests continue. And so, look, I think one thing we've learned from President Trump and his foreign policy is, by and large, he ain't bluffing. And so when President Trump says, we've got your back, and other supportive words, he's in a pickle in the one hand because his base and the American people do not want foreign entanglements and certainly boots on the ground. But on the other hand, he's shown in places like Venezuela that he can go in with surgical-like precision and achieve an objective and leave. And I suspect we're going to see some iteration of that where he's going to go in with certain strategic support to give the Iranian people an opportunity at regime change. And hopefully that sticks, because I know the American people don't have an appetite for prolonged and sustained engagement over there.
David, do you agree if the president ain't bluffing, in John's words? I mean, how big of an action could we see? He has hinted at some sort of military action.
I don't agree with John that we could do an operation that is surgical precision. In other words, a limited operation like we did in Venezuela to take out, a few leaders, and that would result in regime change. The IRGC and the regime are committed to having Iran continue to be a clerical state. And I don't think they're going to give that up just because they lose a leader or two. I believe that there's going to have to be an armed opposition. Again, you either have to arm groups inside Iran or you have to have foreign troops on the ground. I believe that's the only way that there's actually going to be regime change in Iran, because the Iranian regime is so good at repression, has the tools to put down the protests if they want to do that. There's going to be a lot of backlash if they do that, but I don't think they're going to loosen their grip unless they are confronted with arms, either from a foreign intervention or from the arming of groups inside Iran.
Yeah, I think right now, many people waiting to see exactly what the president does decide to do. David Tafuri, former foreign policy advisor for the Obama campaign. John Thomas, Republican strategist. Great to get your thoughts tonight. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Carl.
Thank you.
All right, around the world and across the UK, this is BBC News.